Chapter 1. The Unlikely Recruit. The galaxy was an endless expanse of wonder and danger, but Captain Thor had seen more of the latter in his decades of spacefaring than he'd care to admit. The captain of the Stellar Wanderer was a veteran of countless skirmishes, near-death experiences, and the general chaos that came with running a ragtag crew through some of the most lawless regions of the cosmos. His ship, a patchwork of outdated technology and salvaged parts, was barely holding together, much like its captain. Yet, despite, or perhaps because of, the ship's dilapidated state, the Wanderer had developed a reputation for pulling through the most impossible of odds. It was on one such day, while docked at a particularly seedy spaceport on the edge of the Borkus system, that Captain Thor found himself faced with a decision that would either save his ship or doom it once and for all. "You're joking, Captain Zack," rumbled Thor, his three eyes blinking in rapid succession as he stared at the holographic display in front of him. The hologram showed a human in full environment gear, which only added to his rising sense of dread. "A human? You want me to take a human aboard my ship?" The hiring agent on the other side of the transmission was a gelatinous blob named Glop. Glop was a well-known figure in the underbelly of the galaxy, infamous for brokering deals and securing crew members for the most desperate of captains. If you needed someone who was either brave or foolish enough to work on your ship, Glop was your go-to. Today, though, Thor was beginning to wonder if he'd made a mistake contacting him. Glop's form wobbled slightly, a shrug in the body language of his species. "Look, Captain, I know it's not ideal, but they're the only applicant we've got for the position. And let's face it, you need an engineer who can handle those plasma coils of yours. The last one barely lasted 2 solar cycles before they were fried to a crisp. You're lucky I found anyone at all willing to take on the job." Thor's tentacles twitched in irritation, knocking over a cup of fermented swamp gas on his console. The liquid hissed as it evaporated almost instantly in the recycled air of his quarters. "But a human?" he protested, his voice rough and gravelly from years of shouting orders over the din of a malfunctioning ship. "Have you heard the stories about them? They're practically walking biohazards, not to mention the fact that they're completely unpredictable. How am I supposed to trust one with something as critical as our plasma coils?" Glop's gelatinous form rippled with what might have been laughter. "Oh, come on, Captain. You can't believe everything you hear in those sleazy spaceboards. Besides, this one comes highly recommended, top of their class at the Galactic Engineering Academy. They've got the skills, and more importantly, the nerve to work on a ship like yours." "That's what worries me," Thor muttered, his scales shifting from a deep blue to a sickly green, a sign of his growing unease. He knew he needed an engineer, and quickly. The last run-in with a group of particularly nasty space pirates had left the Wanderer's engines in dire need of repair, and the ship's plasma coils were one malfunction away from blowing them all to the nearest star system. But the idea of bringing a human aboard, Thor couldn't shake the feeling that he was inviting disaster. He'd heard the rumors, stories of human engineers who were so obsessed with fixing things that they'd dismantle critical systems just to see how they worked, or who'd rigged up insane contraptions that either saved the day in a spectacular fashion or nearly killed everyone on board. Humans, it was said, were a species of extremes. Brilliant, yes, but also dangerously unpredictable. Glop's voice pulled him out of his thoughts. "Listen, Captain, I wouldn't recommend them if I didn't think they could do the job. You need someone who can think on their feet, someone who's not afraid to get their hands dirty. And from what I've heard, this human is exactly that. So, what do you say? Are you willing to take the risk?" Thor hesitated, his mind racing. He thought of his crew, a motley collection of aliens from all corners of the galaxy, each with their own quirks and specialties. They were a good crew, loyal and hard-working, but they weren't miracle workers. The Wanderer needed someone who could pull off the impossible, someone who could keep the ship flying when it seemed like all hope was lost. And maybe, just maybe, this human could be that person. "Fine," he growled, his voice thick with resignation. "But if this goes sideways, Glop, it's on your gelatinous hide." Glop's form shimmered with what might have been relief, or was it amusement? "Don't worry, Captain. I'm confident you'll be pleasantly surprised. I'll send them over to your ship as soon as possible. Just try to keep an open mind, all right?" Thor cut the transmission without another word, staring at the empty space where Glop's hologram had been. An open mind? That was asking a lot from a captain who had seen just about every form of chaos the galaxy had to offer. He let out a long, slow breath, his mind still racing with the implications of his decision. A human, on his ship. It was either the best decision he'd ever made, or the beginning of the end for the stellar wanderer. Well, he muttered to himself, turning back to the cluttered console in front of him. Only one way to find out. 2 solar cycles later, the wanderer was still docked at the spaceport, its engines silent and its crew restless. The ship was a maze of corridors and compartments, each filled with the humming of old machinery and the distant echoes of the spaceport's activity. The wanderer had seen better days, but it was still a sturdy vessel, one that had survived more than its fair share of scrapes. Its captain, however, was beginning to wonder if he'd finally pushed his luck too far. Zack Thor was pacing the length of the cargo bay, a cavernous space filled with crates of supplies, spare parts, and the occasional piece of junk that the crew had picked up in their travels. His tentacles curled and uncurled with nervous energy, his 3 eyes scanning the bay for any sign of their new engineer. The rest of the crew was giving him a wide berth, knowing better than to approach when he was in one of his moods. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the cargo bay doors hissed open and a figure stepped inside. The human was encased in a bulky environment suit, the helmet's visor reflecting the dim lights of the bay. For a moment, Zack Thor was struck by how out of place the figure looked, like a relic from a forgotten era, a creature from another world that had somehow stumbled into his. "Greetings, Captain," came a tiny, slightly distorted voice from the suit's speaker. "I'm Engineer Sarah Thompson. It's an honor to join your crew." Zack Thor's nostrils flared, trying to catch a whiff of the deadly toxins he'd heard humans exuded. All he got was the faint scent of ozone from the suit's air recyclers. He stared at the figure in front of him, his mind struggling to reconcile the image of the dangerous, unpredictable human he had imagined with the seemingly harmless creature that stood before him. "Welcome aboard," he managed, his voice only slightly strained. "I trust you've been briefed on our unique situation?" The helmet bobbed in what he assumed was a nod. "You mean the fact that your ship is held together by the galactic equivalent of chewing gum and optimism?" "Yes, sir. I look forward to the challenge." Was that sarcasm? Zack Thor wasn't sure. Human communication was notoriously difficult to decipher. He decided to ignore it and pressed on. "Right, well, your quarters are in Cargo Bay 3. We've set up a containment field to, protect you from the ship's atmosphere." "How thoughtful," Sarah replied, and Zack Thor could have sworn he heard a chuckle beneath the static. "I'm sure I'll be quite comfortable, surrounded by crates of spare parts and the occasional space rat." As they made their way through the ship's winding corridors, Zack Thor couldn't help but notice how the other crew members scattered at the sight of the human. Geel, the ship's cook, actually climbed up a wall to avoid crossing their path, his many legs scrambling for purchase on the metal panels. Sarah, for her part, seemed oblivious to the commotion she was causing, her attention focused on the ship's interior, as if she were already mentally cataloging everything that needed fixing. "So," she said, her tone conversational, "I hear you've got some issues with your plasma coils. Mind if I take a look after I settle in?" Zack Thor's third eye twitched nervously. "Ah, yes, about that. Are you sure you're equipped to handle such delicate machinery? I mean, with your unique physiology?" The helmet turned towards him, and he had the unsettling feeling that the human was grinning behind that opaque visor. "Oh, don't worry, Captain. I've got nerves of steel and hands steady enough to thread a needle in 0G. Your plasma coils are in good hands." "That's what I'm afraid of," Zack Thor muttered under his breath. They reached Cargo Bay 3, a smaller, less cluttered space than the main cargo bay, but still filled with the detritus of years of spacefaring. Zack Thor gestured vaguely to a corner where a small makeshift bed had been set up next to a stack of empty crates. "Here we are, home sweet home," he said, trying to sound more enthusiastic than he felt. "Let me know if you need anything. Within reason." Sarah set her gear down on the bed, the suit's joints creaking slightly as she moved. "This will do just fine, Captain. I've slept in worse places." Zack Thor wasn't sure if that was meant to be reassuring or not. "Right. Well, I'll leave you to get settled. Report to engineering in an hour. There's a lot of work to be done." "Looking forward to it," Sarah replied cheerfully, already beginning to unpack a set of tools from a nearby crate. Zack Thor lingered for a moment longer, watching as the human went about her business with a confidence that was both impressive and unsettling. Finally, he turned and left the cargo bay, his thoughts a tangled mess of worry and curiosity. As he made his way back to the bridge, Zach Thor couldn't shake the feeling that he had just made the biggest mistake of his career. But as the ship's lights flickered briefly, another sign of the growing list of problems that needed fixing, he also felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this human was exactly what the Stellar Wanderer needed. Only time would tell. And as Captain Zach Thor settled into his chair on the bridge, staring out at the endless expanse of stars that awaited them, he couldn't help but wonder what the future held for him, his crew, and the unlikely engineer who had just joined their ranks. Chapter 2. First Impressions. The day had finally come. Sarah Thompson, the first human to set foot on the Stellar Wanderer, stood before the ship's main engineering console, her gloved hands hovering over a series of ancient, jury-rigged controls. The room was a cacophony of whirring gears, buzzing circuits, and the occasional sharp crackle of electricity from exposed wiring. It was a miracle the ship was still running at all, let alone able to survive the brutalities of deep space. But to Sarah, it was a wonderland of possibilities, a machine on the verge of falling apart, yet somehow still defying the odds. Well, she muttered to herself, let's see what we're working with here. Her initial assessment of the plasma coils had not been promising. The coils, responsible for generating the energy that powered the ship's engines, were old and battered, with hairline fractures snaking across their surface like spiderwebs. They should have been replaced years ago, but it was clear that the Wanderer's budget hadn't allowed for such luxuries. Instead, the previous engineers had patched them up with whatever they could find, scraps of metal, bits of wire, and in one particularly concerning case, what looked like a piece of chewing gum. This is a death trap, she breathed, her voice tinged with both horror and awe. How are we not all dead? She glanced around the engineering bay, her eyes taking in the rest of the room. It was a chaotic mess of tools, spare parts, and old manuals, all haphazardly strewn about as if the previous engineers had been in the middle of a mad scramble to keep the ship running. There was a certain beauty in the chaos, a testament to the ingenuity and desperation of those who had come before her. But now, it was up to Sarah to make sense of it all. With a deep breath, she rolled up her sleeves, figuratively of course, since her environment suit didn't exactly have sleeves, and got to work. The first order of business was to stabilize the plasma coils. If they failed, the entire ship would go up in flames faster than a rocket on launch day. She carefully removed the makeshift patches, her fingers moving with the precision of a surgeon as she inspected each coil for damage. It wasn't long before she found the source of the most recent issue, a small but critical crack in the primary coil, hidden beneath a layer of hastily applied adhesive. Okay, this is bad, she muttered, reaching for a laser welder. But nothing we can't fix. Hours passed as Sarah worked tirelessly, her focus unwavering despite the mounting challenges. She welded, soldered, and rewired, her mind racing with calculations and contingency plans. She was in her element, the thrill of the challenge driving her forward. It was as if the entire universe had faded away, leaving only her and the machine she was determined to save. Unbeknownst to her, she had an audience. Captain Zach Thor stood in the doorway of the engineering bay, his three eyes narrowed as he watched the human work. He had come down to check on her progress, half expecting to find the engineering bay in flames, or at least a complete disaster. Instead, he found Sarah deep in concentration, her movements precise and deliberate. The usual chaos of the engineering bay seemed almost controlled under her hands. She's good, he admitted to himself grudgingly. Too good. He watched as Sarah finished welding the crack in the primary coil, her visor reflecting the bright sparks that flew from the welder. When she was done, she leaned back, inspecting her work with a critical eye. There was no sign of the crack now, just a smooth, seamless surface where the damage had been. That should hold, she said aloud, more to herself than anyone else, at least until I can get my hands on a proper replacement. Captain Thor cleared his throat, finally making his presence known. Sarah jumped slightly, her helmeted head snapping in his direction. "Captain," she exclaimed, straightening up. "I didn't see you there." "Clearly," Thor replied, his tone neutral. "How's it coming?" "Well, it's not going to be a permanent fix," Sarah admitted, wiping a bead of sweat from her forehead, though the gesture was more instinctive than necessary, given that she was still in her suit. "But it should keep the coils from blowing up in the next few days." I'll need to fabricate some new parts, though, if we want to avoid any more incidents. Captain Thor nodded, his tentacles twitching thoughtfully. We're not exactly swimming in credits, Engineer Thompson. You'll have to make do with what we've got. Sarah smiled behind her visor. Oh, I'm used to that, Captain. Give me a few hours and I'll have a list of everything we need. I'm sure we can scrounge up most of it from the junkyard. I mean the cargo bay. Thor allowed himself a small, grudging smile. The human had a sense of humor, at least. Good, I'll leave you to it then, but keep me updated. And remember, this ship is old, and she's been through a lot. Treat her with respect. Sarah's smile faded slightly as she turned back to the console. I know, Captain. Don't worry. I'll take good care of her. As Captain Thor left the engineering bay, his thoughts were a swirl of conflicting emotions. On the one hand, he couldn't deny that Sarah was exactly what the Wanderer needed. A skilled, resourceful engineer who could keep the ship flying against all odds. But on the other hand, he couldn't shake the feeling that she was a ticking time bomb, a wild card who could either save them all or bring everything crashing down. Only time would tell which it would be. Before proceeding, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Chapter 3. The Test. The Stellar Wanderer had been in space for nearly a week since Sarah Thompson had joined the crew, and so far, the ship had held together remarkably well. The plasma coils were stable, the engines were humming along without a hitch, and the constant flickering of the ship's lights had finally stopped. Sarah had managed to patch up a dozen other critical systems, each fix earning her a mix of grudging respect and wary glances from the rest of the crew. But today, the real test had arrived. Captain, we're picking up a distress signal, called out Sharn, the Wanderer's communications officer, her voice tense as she studied the readouts on her screen. Sharn, a tall, lanky creature with a neck that stretched out like a periscope, had been with Captain Thor longer than any other crew member. Her sharp instincts and calm demeanor had saved the ship on more than one occasion, and Thor trusted her judgment implicitly. A distress signal? Captain Thor's tentacles tightened around the arms of his chair. Where's it coming from? Sector 5X3, Sharn replied, her voice growing more urgent. It's faint, but it's definitely a distress call. Looks like it's from a cargo ship, the Golden Horizon. The Golden Horizon? Thor repeated, his three eyes narrowing. That's a big ship. What's it doing out here, and why is it in trouble? Sharn shook her head, her neck extending even further as she adjusted the ship's sensors. I can't tell, Captain. The signal's weak, and there's a lot of interference. But it's definitely in distress. Thor's mind raced. The Golden Horizon was a well-known cargo vessel, famous for its size and the valuable goods it carried. If it was in trouble, that meant two things: potential salvage and a whole lot of danger. But there was no question about what they had to do. In the lawless regions of space, there was an unspoken code among captains. If you received a distress call, you answered it. Otherwise, you might be the one sending out a call no one would respond to. Sharn, set a course for Sector 5X3, Thor ordered, his voice firm. Let's see what's going on out there. The Stellar Wanderer changed course, its engines flaring to life as it headed toward the source of the distress signal. The crew moved into action, each member taking their position with the precision born of years of experience. Sarah Thompson was no exception. She had been monitoring the engines when the call came in, and now she was running a full diagnostic, making sure everything was in working order. What's going on, Captain? She asked over the comm, her voice crackling slightly with static. We've picked up a distress signal from a cargo ship, Thor replied. We're heading to investigate. I want you to be ready in case we need to make a quick getaway, or if we end up needing to tow a ship twice our size. Understood, Captain, Sarah replied, her voice calm. I'll make sure the engines are ready for anything. As the Wanderer approached Sector 5X3, the tension on the bridge was palpable. The ship was flying through a particularly dense asteroid field, the rocks tumbling through space with lethal speed. It was a treacherous area, one that most ships avoided unless absolutely necessary. But Thor had no choice. The Golden Horizon was somewhere in this mess, and time was running out. There! Sharn exclaimed, her voice tinged with relief. I've got a visual on the horizon. The view screen flickered to life, showing a massive cargo ship drifting through the asteroid field. The ship was battered and scarred, its hull pockmarked with impact craters and scorch marks. It was clear that the horizon had been through a fierce battle, but there was no sign of any attackers. The ship was dead in the water, its engines silent and its lights flickering weakly. "What the hell happened to them?" muttered Jax, the Wanderer's weapons officer, his clawed hands hovering over the controls. Jax was a hulking brute of a creature, with a face that looked like it had been carved out of rock and a temper to match. He lived for combat, and the sight of the damaged ship had him on edge. "Looks like they were hit by something big," Thor replied, his eyes scanning the wreckage. "But I don't see any other ships in the area. Sharn, keep an eye on the sensors. If there's anything out there, I want to know about it." "Aye, Captain," Sharn said, her long fingers dancing over the controls. Thor leaned forward in his chair, his mind racing. There was something off about this whole situation. The Golden Horizon was a heavily armed ship, more than capable of defending itself. Whatever had taken it down had to be powerful, and still lurking nearby. But the distress signal was genuine, and he couldn't ignore it. "Jax, get a team ready," Thor ordered. "We're going over there." Jax grinned, baring his sharp teeth. "About time we saw some action." "Sharn, you have the bridge," Thor continued, rising from his chair. "Sarah, I want you with me. If there's anyone left alive over there, we'll need your skills." "On my way, Captain," Sarah replied, already making her way to the airlock. The Wanderer maneuvered closer to the horizon, its docking clamps extending to latch onto the cargo ship's hull. The airlock hissed open, revealing a dark, smoke-filled corridor leading into the heart of the horizon. Thor led the way, his blaster drawn and his senses on high alert. Jax followed close behind, his massive frame filling the corridor, while Sarah brought up the rear, her eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. "Stay sharp," Thor warned, his voice low. "We don't know what's waiting for us in here." They moved through the ship in silence, the only sound the faint hum of the Wanderer's systems echoing through the airlock. The horizon was eerily quiet, its usual hustle and bustle replaced by an oppressive stillness. The walls were scorched and blackened, evidence of the battle that had taken place here, but there were no bodies, no signs of the crew. It was as if they had simply vanished. "Captain, this doesn't feel right," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackling of her comm. "Where is everyone?" "I don't know," Thor admitted, his eyes narrowing. "But stay on your guard. Jax, check the cargo hold. Sarah, see if you can access the ship's logs. Maybe we can figure out what happened here." Jax nodded, breaking off from the group to head toward the cargo hold. Sarah moved to a nearby console, her fingers flying over the controls as she tried to bring up the horizon's logs. Thor stood guard, his blaster at the ready, every instinct telling him that something was very, very wrong. "Got it," Sarah said after a few tense moments. "Captain, the logs show that they were attacked by something. The crew managed to send out the distress signal, but the last entry just stops." "Stops?" Thor repeated, frowning. "What do you mean, stops?" "I mean it cuts off mid-sentence," Sarah replied, her brow furrowing, like they didn't even have time to finish their report. Whatever hit them, it was fast and powerful. Thor's grip on his blaster tightened. "Jax, what's your status?" "Cargo hold's a mess," Jax's voice crackled over the comm. "Looks like they were hauling something big, some kind of artifact, but it's gone. All I'm seeing are empty crates and debris." "An artifact?" Thor's mind raced. Artifacts were rare and valuable, often carrying untold power or danger. If the Horizon had been transporting something like that, it would explain the attack. But where was it now? "Captain, we need to get out of here," Sarah urged, her voice rising with alarm. "If whatever took out the Horizon is still around—" Before she could finish, the ship shuddered violently, throwing them all off balance. Alarms blared to life, and the lights flickered wildly as the Wanderer's systems went into overdrive. "Captain, we've got company." Sharn's voice came over the comm, panic evident in her usually calm tone. "A ship just appeared out of nowhere, massive, heavily armed." "Get us out of here now," Thor shouted, grabbing Sarah by the arm and pulling her toward the airlock. "Jax, fall back, we're leaving." The ship shuddered again, this time more violently, as the enemy vessel opened fire. The corridors of the Horizon twisted and buckled as explosions ripped through its hull. Thor and Sarah raced through the chaos, dodging falling debris and leaping over twisted metal as they made their way back to the airlock. They barely made it in time. The Wanderer disengaged from the Horizon, its engines roaring to life as it accelerated away from the doomed cargo ship. Behind them, the Horizon exploded in a brilliant flash of light, consumed by the enemy's relentless assault. "Sharn, status report," Thor barked as they stumbled onto the bridge. his heart pounding in his chest. "We're clear for now," Sharn replied, her voice tight with strain. "But that ship, whatever it was unlike anything I've ever seen. It just disappeared after the horizon blew up." "Disappeared?" Thor repeated, his mind reeling. "How is that possible?" "I don't know, Captain," Sharn admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "But it's gone, and so is the horizon." Thor collapsed into his chair, his tentacles trembling with a mixture of relief and fear. They had barely escaped with their lives, and the mystery of what had destroyed the golden horizon and taken the artifact was still unresolved. Sarah slumped into the chair next to him, her helmet clutched in her hands. That was too close," she breathed, her voice shaky. "What the hell was that thing?" "I don't know," Thor replied, staring out at the empty expanse of space where the horizon had once been. "But whatever it was, it's still out there. And I have a feeling we haven't seen the last of it." Chapter 4, Secrets in the Dark. The aftermath of the Golden Horizon's destruction weighed heavily on the crew of the Stellar Wanderer. Days had passed since their narrow escape, but the tension aboard the ship was palpable. Everyone was on edge, their nerves frayed by the uncertainty and fear that had settled over them like a thick fog. The Wanderer's usual routine had been upended, replaced by a constant state of vigilance as they tried to make sense of what had happened. Captain Thor sat alone in his quarters, staring at the datapad in his hands. It contained everything they had managed to salvage from the Horizon's logs, fragments of information, half-finished reports, and a few garbled transmissions that offered little in the way of answers. He had gone over the data dozens of times, hoping to find something, anything, that could explain what they had encountered. But all he had were more questions. There was a knock at his door, and Thor looked up, his 3 eyes narrowing. "Come in." The door slid open and Sarah Thompson stepped inside, her face pale but determined. "Captain, we need to talk." Thor gestured for her to sit, his expression grim. "I assume this is about the horizon." "Yes," Sarah said, taking a seat across from him. "I've been going over the data we recovered and, well, there's something you need to see." She handed him a datapad, her fingers trembling slightly. Thor took it and began scrolling through the information, his eyes scanning the screen with growing intensity. The logs were incomplete, but one fragment caught his attention, a reference to the artifact that Jax had mentioned. It was brief, just a few lines of text, but it was enough to send a chill down his spine. "The artifact is of unknown origin," he read aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. "Possesses energy signatures unlike anything recorded, potentially sentient. Crew advised to exercise extreme caution." Thor looked up at Sarah, his expression grim. "This doesn't sound like any ordinary cargo." "It's not," Sarah replied, her voice tense. "Captain, I've seen references to artifacts like this before, in old Terran records, classified documents from before the collapse. They were always vague, but they hinted at something dangerous, something that could change the balance of power in the galaxy." Thor's tentacles twitched in agitation. "And now it's out there, in the hands of whoever destroyed the horizon." Sarah nodded, her eyes dark with worry. "We don't know who they are or what they want, but we do know one thing: they're powerful, and they're not afraid to use that power." Thor leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. The situation was worse than he had imagined. The destruction of the horizon was just the beginning. Whatever force was behind it, they had something far more dangerous in their possession now, and the Wanderer was right in the middle of it. "We can't take this lightly," Thor said finally, his voice steady. "We need to find out who these people are and what they're planning. If that artifact is as dangerous as you say, we can't let it fall into the wrong hands." "But how do we do that?" Sarah asked, her voice tinged with desperation. "We don't even know where to start." Thor was silent for a moment, his mind working through the possibilities. Then slowly, a plan began to take shape. It was risky, and it would require every bit of cunning and skill they had, but it was their only chance. "We start by tracking them down," Thor said, his voice firm. "We know they were after the horizon, and we know they have some way of cloaking their ship, but they can't stay hidden forever. We'll follow the energy signature of that artifact. If it's as unique as the logs suggest, it should leave a trail." Sarah nodded, her determination returning. "And once we find them?" "Then we'll do whatever it takes to stop them," Thor replied, his eyes blazing with resolve. We'll gather allies, arm ourselves to the teeth, and if necessary, we'll destroy that artifact before it can be used against us." It was a bold plan, one that carried immense risks. But as Thor looked into Sarah's eyes, he knew they had no other choice. The galaxy was on the brink of a new era, one that could either bring salvation or destruction, and the Stellar Wanderer would be at the center of it all. Chapter 5. Allies and Enemies. The journey to track down the mysterious enemy and their artifact led the Stellar Wanderer into some of the most dangerous regions of space. Captain Thor had charted a course that took them through lawless sectors, past abandoned outposts, and into the territory of old rivals and potential allies. The crew knew that they were venturing into the unknown, but the stakes were too high to turn back. "Captain, we're approaching the Oranak system," Sharn reported from her station on the bridge. "Scanners are picking up multiple ships in the area. Looks like a fleet." Thor's tentacles tightened around the arms of his chair. The Oranak system was notorious for being a hotbed of pirate activity and black market dealings. If there was anywhere to find information on their quarry, it was here. But it also meant they were entering a den of vipers, where a wrong move could spell disaster. "Keep us on a steady course, Sharn," Thor ordered, his voice calm. "Let's not make any sudden moves." The Wanderer glided through the system, its sleek form a sharp contrast to the hulking, rusted ships that filled the area. The pirate fleet was an eclectic mix of vessels, ranging from old Terran battleships to alien cruisers, all bristling with weapons and battle scars. As they approached the heart of the system, a transmission crackled over the comm. "Unidentified vessel. This is Captain Rask of the Blood Talons," a gravelly voice snarled. "State your business in our territory, or prepare to be boarded." Thor leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. He knew of Captain Rask by reputation, a ruthless pirate lord with a penchant for violence and a long list of enemies. But Rask was also a shrewd businessman, and Thor was counting on that. "This is Captain Thor of the Stellar Wanderer," Thor replied, his voice steady. "We're here on business, Rask. Information is what we seek, and we're willing to pay for it." There was a long pause, during which Thor could practically feel Rask weighing his options. Finally, the pirate captain's voice crackled back over the comm, laced with a dangerous curiosity. "Information, huh? And what kind of information would be worth risking your neck in my system, Thor?" "Something big," Thor replied, choosing his words carefully. "Something that could tip the balance of power in this sector and beyond." Another pause, shorter this time. Then Rask's voice returned, dripping with intrigue. "All right, Wanderer. Dock at Station K9, but don't try anything funny. My boys are eager for a fight, and I'd hate to disappoint them." The transmission cut off, and Thor allowed himself a small sigh of relief. They were in, but the hard part was just beginning. "Sharn, bring us in," Thor ordered, his mind already working through their next steps. "And get ready for trouble. I don't trust Rask as far as I can throw him." "Aye, Captain," Sharn replied, guiding the Wanderer toward the designated station. As they docked, the crew prepared for what was sure to be a tense meeting. Jax armed himself to the teeth, his massive form practically bristling with weapons. Sarah double-checked her tools, ready to deal with any technical issues that might arise. Thor, however, was focused on the bigger picture. If Rask had any information on the artifact or the ship that had destroyed the horizon, it could be the key to their mission. The docking clamps secured, and the airlock hissed open, revealing a dimly lit corridor that led into the heart of the pirate station. The air was thick with the scent of oil, smoke, and something less pleasant, likely the remnants of whatever unsavory business had taken place here recently. "Stay close," Thor muttered to his crew, his eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of danger. They were met by a group of pirates, each one more rough-looking than the last. At their head was Captain Rask, a towering figure with a scarred face, his eyes glinting with a mix of suspicion and interest. He was flanked by two hulking brutes, each one armed to the teeth and looking eager for a fight. "Thor," Rask growled, his voice like gravel. "I didn't think I'd ever see you again. Last time we met, I seem to recall you putting a few holes in one of my ships." "Business is business," Thor replied evenly, meeting Rask's gaze without flinching. "But I'm not here to relive old times. I'm here because I need information, and I'm willing to pay for it." Rask chuckled, a sound that held little humor. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But I don't work cheap, Thor. What's this information worth to you?" Thor reached into his coat and pulled out a small, heavily encrypted data chip. "I have something that might interest you. Naval codes for a Terran supply convoy heading through this sector in 2 weeks. Should be more than enough to cover the cost. Rask's eyes lit up with greed as he eyed the chip. Now you're talking. All right, I'll bite. What do you want to know? Thor didn't hesitate. I'm looking for a ship. Massive, heavily armed with cloaking capabilities. It destroyed the Golden Horizon in Sector 5X3 and took an artifact of unknown origin. We need to know who's behind it and where they're heading. Rask's expression darkened slightly at the mention of the Horizon. The Golden Horizon, you say? That's a name I've been hearing a lot lately. Word on the black market is that someone's been after that ship for a long time. Something about an ancient artifact they were hauling. He paused, his eyes narrowing as he leaned in closer. But if what you're saying is true, that this ship took the artifact, then you're chasing something more dangerous than you can imagine. I've heard whispers, Thor. Whispers of a shadowy organization, one that's been pulling strings across the galaxy for years. No one knows who they are, but they've got resources, power, and a taste for the arcane. Thor's heart sank. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed was another matter entirely. Do you know where they might be heading? Rask shook his head, a grim smile on his lips. If I did, I wouldn't be standing here talking to you. But I can tell you this, there's a place deep in uncharted space where they say these shadowy figures gather. A hidden world, shrouded in darkness, and protected by forces beyond our understanding. If that's where they're headed, you're in for a hell of a ride. Thor clenched his fists, his resolve hardening. Then that's where we'll go. Rask chuckled again, this time with genuine amusement. You've got guts, Thor. I'll give you that. But you're going to need more than guts to survive this. You're going to need allies, and lots of them. We'll take our chances, Thor replied, his voice firm. Now, do we have a deal? Rask eyed the data chip in Thor's hand, then nodded. We've got a deal. But remember, Thor, if you cross me again, I'll make sure it's the last thing you ever do. Thor handed over the chip, sealing the agreement. As Rask turned to leave, the captain of the Wanderer couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding. They had taken the first step on a path that could lead to their doom, but there was no turning back now. Let's get back to the ship, Thor ordered, his voice low. We've got a long journey ahead of us. As the crew made their way back to the Wanderer, Thor's mind was already working on the next steps. They needed to prepare, gather allies, stock up on supplies, and arm themselves for the battle ahead. The galaxy was a dangerous place, but they had faced impossible odds before and come out on top. But as the Wanderer left the Oranak system behind, Thor couldn't shake the feeling that this time things would be different. The shadowy organization they were up against was unlike any enemy they had ever faced, and the artifact they were after was more powerful and more dangerous than anything they had ever encountered. The crew of the Stellar Wanderer was heading into the unknown, and only time would tell if they would emerge victorious or be consumed by the darkness that awaited them. Chapter 6. Into the Abyss. The journey to find the shadowy organization and their artifact took the Stellar Wanderer into uncharted space, a vast expanse of the galaxy where few dared to venture. The stars here were distant and cold, their light barely penetrating the inky blackness that surrounded the ship. It was a place of ancient mysteries and long-forgotten secrets, where the laws of physics seemed to twist and bend in ways that defied explanation. Captain Thor stood on the bridge, his eyes fixed on the viewscreen as the Wanderer cut through the void. The crew was tense, their nerves frayed by the uncertainty of what lay ahead. They had faced countless dangers before, but this felt different, more ominous, more unpredictable. If you enjoy this video, then don't forget to like the video, subscribe to my channel, and hit the notification bell.